Hello, good evening. We're going to get started. Thank you for coming and welcome to the Met. I am Eleanor Suha-hyun, the Korea Foundation and Samsung Foundation of Culture curator here at the Met. Tonight, we have a double feature, a lecture followed by a screening, and these events are presented in conjunction with the special exhibition, Lineages Korean Art at the Met. That exhibition is on the second floor in the Arts of Korea Gallery and is on view for another month until October 20th. Lineages was conceived as a celebration of the 25th anniversary of the creation of the Arts of Korea Gallery, and it is the Met's first exhibition to focus on Korean modern and contemporary art. Lineages juxtaposes historic and contemporary art to foster a dialogue of ideas that resonate across time. I am so pleased to have tonight's events since they build upon and expand upon the artists and the ideas in Lineages. Before I forget, I want to thank the Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism of the Republic of Korea, since the exhibition and these events would not be possible without their support. It is a great pleasure to welcome back Joan Key to New York City as the Judy and Michael Starnhart Director of the Institute of Fine Arts. And so she is now also a neighbor. Joan is a specialist in modern and contemporary art and has written extensively on Korean art from the 18th century landscape painting to the performances of Sung Neung-kyung, a leading conceptual and performance artist. One of her first published writings was on Liebel's Majestic Splendor in 1997. And for those of you who have not looked at this year's Met's Genesis Facade Commission, Longtail Halo by Liebel, I encourage you to do so when you are exiting the building tonight. Joan's publications are too numerous to recite here, but I will highlight a few. Her books include Contemporary Korean Art, Tansekwa and the Urgency of Method, published in 2013, and The Geometries of Afro-Asia, Art Beyond Solidarity, her most recent book published last year in 2023. She is currently working on a new project titled The Korean Middle Class, Art History Against Development. As a preeminent scholar, her talk tonight will undoubtedly expand our minds by discussing artists and works from the end of the 19th century until 1970, many of which will be unfamiliar to most of us. So without further delay, please welcome Joan Key to give her talk with the great title, Where, in What Form Shall We Meet Again? On 20th Century Art in Korea.
Great. Thank you very much, Eleanor, for your very generous introduction. I'd also like to thank Mariano Siciliano, Isaac Poole, and Gabriel Mungo of Public Programs and Education. Sometimes the labor that goes into making these things happen needs to be more acknowledged, so thank you. I thought it fitting to start with a, I thought it fitting to start with a painting made in New York City. And it's by Kim Hwang-gi, who is as recognizable in Korea as any celebrity. It's one of his famous dot paintings, and it's something he made while living here from 1963 to 1974, where a single dot activates a space bounded by lines. The effect mimics cellular groupings, but also produces the sense of gazing at something very far away. It's not for nothing, then, that Kim named his painting after a poem his dear friend Kim Kwang-sup wrote in 1969 called Evening. And there are two lines that stand out in particular. The first is, "Of the many stars in the sky, one looks at me." And that's a line that really gets at the heart of how even the biggest canvases that Kim has executed feels oddly familiar. Even in vastness, one can find intimacy. The second line of the poem that I want to highlight is the title of today's talk, Where, in What Form Shall We Meet Again? And it's something that I'd like for us to remember because what we'll see today is a 20th century rife with doublings, double takes, redoublings, and doubling backs. And I'd like to think of this talk as having 5 short acts. And for Act 1, consider one of the more intriguing and prominent connoisseurial mysteries in Korean art. It's a mystery both because we don't know who made it exactly, or when it was made, but also because of its format and subject. It's a rare double portrait, but even more strangely, it features the very sovereign of Korea, the king of Joseon, who at that time was Gojong. He's wearing elaborate attire, which in Korean is known as myeonbok, and it's modeled after myeonfu, worn by monarchs and rulers in China from the Shang to the Ming dynasties. The myeonbok represents the most formal level of dress traditionally worn by the Joseon king, with 9 crests, but here there are 12, the same as for the Ming emperor. So effectively, Gojong had promoted himself from the king of Joseon, which he was since 1864, to the Daehan emperor, which he became in 1897. Now, Korea was never an empire in the classical sense. There was no foreign conquest involved, nor were there peripheries over which a central state ruled. But the Daehan 제국, the Daehan Empire, was nevertheless a declaration of both independence from an old world order, where Korea was China's little sibling, and it was a claim to a new geopolitical order, where empires, rather than nations or kingdoms, took precedence. This is one of the beginnings of Korea's 20th century. And that's not all that's curious about this singular portrait. Gojong is split into 2, and he is painted almost as if we are sharing his space. He's looking at himself in the mirror, and it's a very different kind of portrait than the usual template for royal portraiture, which you see on the left, with its insistent frontality and size. And here the 2 images are roughly in scale to one another. Both works, I argue, are likely made by the same artist, Choi Young-shin. Choi Young-shin was a high-ranking court artist who had daily physical access to Gojong, but he also took private commissions while off duty, and that is where I believe the work on the right was executed. Choi was also known for the careful delineation of the face, anticipating his process of painting from photographs, and his approach to depiction is motivated by both an embrace and skepticism of photographic detail. Now, the photo on the right was taken by the polymath Kim Gyu-jin, who would later open Korea's first photo studio. And the work you see on the right, which is in the collection of the Newark Museum, was given to Edward Harriman, the US railroad magnate, who attempted to build what at that time would have been the most ambitious rail system in the world. But the Gojong here is not the Gojong of the double portrait, looking both forward, sideways, and backwards. The Gojong in the photograph is not even sitting in his own throne room. He's in a corridor of the reception hall of the Jeongmyeongjeon, the red brick building designed by the only European in Gojong's employ, the Russian architect Seradin Sabatin. And you notice that he looks hemmed in the corner. There is a certain kind of perhaps melancholy about his gaze. Perhaps it's not surprising that the Gojong circa 1900 would be different than the Gojong of 1905. For Korea was ground zero for Japanese imperial ambitions, as vividly depicted on the right by the great woodcut artist Kobayashi Kiyochika. The Russo-Japanese War was in full force on Korean land and even became a literal playing field in a popular board game manufactured by the Milton Bradley Game Company, which some of you may know is responsible for Candyland and Chutes and Ladders. Eventually, Korea would become a Japanese colony in 1910. So here I end Act 1, and we go to Act 2. So let us turn now to another pair of images made at the tail end of Japanese occupation in Korea. 2 women are portrayed side by side. One works outside the home, one is inside the home. Both are different facets of what in the early 20th century was internationally known as the new woman, the independent, cultured, educated woman. What was key about the new woman discussion in Korea was its multiplicity. That discussion emphasized both the female production of knowledge and female knowledge expressed through habits of consumption, namely great taste. And that's something that's abundantly pictured on the right with the lavish furniture, the piano, and the book of poetry. Epitomizing much of this new woman was Park Ne-hyun. She would become one of Korea's most important artists, who happened to be a woman, who made the case for how scientific education could not be separated from artistic intelligence. Her depiction of a skeleton was made just before she attended the Women's School of Art and Design, now the present-day Joshibi University of Art and Design in Tokyo. And she stresses how close looking lay at the heart of both art and science, a point emphasized by the photograph of women students at Gyeongsang Women's Medical College, founded in 1938, now present-day Korea University Medical Center. In another vein, female consumption, and specifically consumption in the form of critical judgment, became more prominent. Here before us are two covers of New Woman, Shinyeosang, a leading magazine targeting both homemakers and students. One notes how the woman on the left holds a quill as if she was holding a cigarette, because as we all know, smoking and writing are bedfellows. You can't have one without the other. But there is a stark difference between the 1930s and 40s, where we see an image of a female miner on the right, an explicit nod to women who assume jobs usually held by men, for this is wartime. Both depictions, though, contrast significantly what was celebrated in the Korean colonial art world. On the left is a prime example of miindo, or the beautiful woman genre. And here it's reinterpreted by Kim Eun-ho, one of the most acclaimed Korean artists in colonial Seoul. That she is an idealized figure goes without saying. It goes further without saying that I highly doubt she would have gotten on with the chain-smoking, book-gobbling, ankle-bearing floozy on the right. And I doubt that our writer would have found Kim's ideal woman much fun. Now, let's take that up a notch a little bit and consider this pairing. In a work conspicuously called Flat Bed, Tsuchida Bakusen, a very successful Japanese artist in Korea, depicted a pair of women, most likely courtesans, as if they were extensions of furniture. They droop, they seem pliable, and it's of a very different kind of formal depiction than the dejected sag we see in Na Sang-yoon's nude on the right. Far from the stereotype of the carefree, spendthrift modern girl so commonly circulated in Korean mass media at this time, the portrait on the right underscores perhaps a connection between Na Sang-yoon, who was a Korean woman studying in Tokyo, and her unnamed model, likely a Japanese woman around her own age. I want to stress here how colonial Korean art was an accumulation of perspectives. Here, an established Japanese man sees a Korean female type, and then you have a Korean woman sympathetically observing a Japanese fellow urban dweller with whom she must have shared much in common. Now, women have not usually figured prominently in Korean art, but Korean art history would not be possible without artists like Park Ne-hyun, Na Sang-yoon, or Baek Nam-sun. The second professional oil painter from Korea after Na Hae-seok, and the first professional Korean women artist to exhibit internationally, she imagines this lush fantasy of a landscape on the occasion of a close friend's wedding. Regarded as lost until it was discovered in 1981, it's populated with forms Baek encountered on her many travels in Tokyo and Paris, includes European religious iconography to large format natural landscape screen paintings. It's nothing short of immersive, and the world Baek Nam-sun creates appears as a rejoinder to various acts of occupation, such as the photograph on the right. So on the right, schoolboys crawling in and out of Cheomseongdae, the oldest surviving astronomical observatory in Asia and possibly the world. It was built in the 7th century in the kingdom of Shilla, and here what was and is a venerable icon becomes reduced to the status of playground. Baek Nam-sun at this time was also one half of the superstar painter couple, along with her husband Im Yong-yeon, whom she had met in Paris. Im had graduated from Yale, the two went back to Korea in 1930, and then Im was displaced to North Korea with the outbreak of the Korean War, and Baek Nam-sun never saw him again. Now, I've paired this with a painting by Lee Kwede on the right, for there are two kinds of shadows involved. So one is, can women ever be validated outside their connections with men, their partners, their teachers, and so forth? At the same time, does the shadow that we see in Lee Kwede's painting foreshadow the traumatic divisions that would mark the Korean peninsula through the Korean War? Lee Kwede himself repatriated to North Korea in the last year of the war in 1953, and he was later purged in the early 1960s. So here we end Act 2, and we move to Act 3 with another artist couple, the first in post-war Korea to show as a married couple. So we have Park Ne-hyun, who we remember from her skeleton, and here she is now with her husband Kim Gi-chang, who had studied with Kim Eun-ho, and whose ink paintings commanded vast critical and institutional attention. But it was Kim who took the lead in examining abstraction in ink painting. In thinking about sight as a fundamentally unsettled condition, she fragmented images. Owls and cats seem to be particular favorites, so that what looks to us as semi-abstract is a recognition of discrepancy between depicted form and the live subject. Her works presage and join with some of the most interesting experiments in mid-century Korean ink painting, such as that of An Dong-suk on the left and Chung Tak-young on the right. Chung Tak-young was a colleague of Seo Seo, whose work you see in Lineages, and his work exemplified itself here with its vocabulary of torn paper, red seal imprints treated like brush marks, and an inventive use of wash and ink. And it's worth remembering that until roughly the mid-1970s, ink painting was the dominant artistic medium in South Korea in terms of sheer volume and also commercial and institutional prominence. Now, I like to think Park Ne-hyun went even further. I like to think that she became an artist of the Americas, by which I mean that unlike all of her contemporaries in oil painting or ink painting for whom Paris was central, she turned decisively to Central America and pre-Columbian culture. The sketch on the left is what she saw of Grand Coquelet patterns existing from 200 BCE to 1500 CE, one of the hundreds she made based on what she had seen in Panama. What she learned from repeating these patterns surfaced later in several of the prints she created after she came to New York City in 1969 to study at the Blackburn Printmaking Workshop and also at Pratt. Park's work defines a cosmopolitan artist as one who intentionally befriends multiple sources of visual thinking, which eventually expanded to include Egyptian textiles, such as in the work on the left. And Park would eventually shift between painting and tapestry to create her own distinct artistic language. And here we arrive at the cover image of today's lecture, an epic work by Song Jung-in. Her embroidery was as much an artistic profession as it was a compound of multiple skills. Embroidery demands working with and against a surface. It requires great discernment in selecting thread weights and colors, given how dependent embroidery is on different types and levels of lighting. The two circles recall the glare of spotlights, while the assembly of smaller circles cannot escape a connection with empirical measurement expressed through clocks and pie charts. At this size and scale, it commands the dignity of painting, and its strong geometry links it further to a vast world of other painterly interventions. To get a better sense, consider Song's work next to a work by her former husband, Kim Gurim, whose experimental works I think many of you have seen in exhibitions here in New York, including at the Guggenheim. Both artists share a commitment to gridded individual units and strong geometrical symmetry. Kim's work relies on the industrial glow of electric lights and draws heavily from the colors used in neon signage, then beginning to rapidly proliferate in Seoul and other cities. Song's sense of color differs entirely. She's taking her cues from traditional color patterns embedded in a long history of embroidery. Where Kim Gurim's work generates electric light, Song Jung-in's work reflects available light so that it will appear to shimmer, radiate, and occasionally even fade, depending on whether we see it in daylight or under artificial illumination. In the hands of artists like Choi Yu-hyun and Song Jung-in, embroidery can lend itself to rigorous precision or organic shapeshifting. Choi's work on the left won an award at the Gukjeon, the national art salon held annually by the South Korean government, which at that time was the most prestigious venue for showing art in Korea. Now, with all of this in mind, I want to fast forward 20 years, in part to recognize the work of Lee Bol, who is responsible for what you see on the Met facade. And so our last act in today's talk lands us in Changheung, in what was then the fairly rural outskirts of Seoul. Lee Bol has taken it upon herself to enter into another body, bulging padded fabric whose deep pink color recalls that of connective tissue underlying the skin swallows her whole. Photographed in mid-movement, she seems to be at war with her own body. Uninhabited tentacle suits lay lifeless on the ground, cast aside. Known at the time for her performances, Lee demonstrates an ongoing struggle with the weight and bulkiness of materials that makes even a simple act like walking laborious and cumbersome. We imagine her steps to be slow and deliberate, sweat rolling from her brow. Breathing is no easy feat. But there is also a fearsomeness. We have the sense of watching a spirit possession where consciousness is altered, heightened, or directed somewhere else. Lee Bol's cravings summons earlier histories of performance based on rituals and customs, especially those associated with women traditionally relegated to the lower strata of Korean society. One of the most important avant-garde dancers of her day, who also played a significant role in Asian American dance history, Hong Shin-ja performed ritual in 1973 at the very time when the Korean government tried to suppress shamanism as a species of anti-modern superstition. Performed in memory of her sister who died after a decade-long illness, the work involved an explosive, primordial scream, expressing unfulfilled desire, all-encompassing grief, and lingering sorrow. The force of sound similarly ballasts the performance of Kim Moon-ja, who recasts the traditional laundry as an action of its own. Performed at the Daegu Experimental Art Show, then the most forward-minded exhibition series in Korea, Kim let out a long moan that eyewitnesses describe as inescapably funereal in tone. It's not clear what she was lamenting, but the image of her reenacting the hard labor that was the lot of generations of Korean women magnified the workload of women without which the so-called miracle on the Han River, the much-touted development of South Korea, would have never taken place. And then speaking of work, it's important to remember where Lee Bol performs and when. It's in a rural area, in a farm. And the farm is far more than simply the opposite of a city, for the work is taking place in what can only be described as the age of the Uruguay round, the biggest global trade negotiation ever to take place. Undertaken in 1988, it had a disproportionate impact on farmers who traditionally enjoyed high government protection. And just to quote one farmer at this time, "We Korean farmers realized that our destinies are no longer in our own hands." Now, Lee Jong-gu himself was the son of a farmer, paints directly on flattened sacks once used to transport rice. Heightened by the thin, vertical format of the painting, the image of a foreshortened excavator looks more than ominous, especially in relation to the farmers, many of whom are women, harvesting red chili peppers below. There is a contest between industrial labor and human bodies industrialization threatens to displace. The larger backdrop of both Lee Jong-gu's work and the land on which Lee performs is the generally fraught situation of land in Korea. After all, the peninsula is divided into two, a point An Dong-suk poignantly raised in a small pencil drawing. Titled Divided Homeland, a gaping abyss is fringed in the background by a row of people whose backs are turned towards us. Some stand with arms around each other, some stand alone. All appear helpless in the face of this abyss. On the left, billowing red clouds of flame in Son Gi-won's painting remind us how environmental disasters were an unspoken but viscerally palpable theme in many works from the late 1970s and early 1980s. Land erosion, pollution, and wildfires became a part of everyday life. And here Son offers yet another take on the landscape genre. Instead of figures, we have spoken utterances. It's a signature move for Son Gi-won, for whom the audible, the oral, and the vocal carry just as much weight as the visual. Consider now a photo collage by Park Bul-dong. In one work, he brings together farmers who never raise their heads, with smiling heads gleaned from advertisements, which he then juxtaposes above what appear to be missiles. Property developed maps cut out to resemble crows and hawks are an allusion to predatorial development and, of course, the ever-present specter of endless war. On the matter of development, an entire subcategory appeared in the late 1970s and early 1980s that might be called developmental surrealism. Like this photo by Kwon Tae-gyun, who himself grew up on a farm near Daegu in South Korea, photos revealed jarringly abrupt juxtapositions of supposedly modern and traditional ways of living. In the now ritzy enclave of Daechidong in Gangnam, one of the first-generation high-rise apartments looms over one of the few remaining thatched roof houses in the area. It's more than a simple contrast between urban and rural ways of living. It's also a contrast between nuclear families living in small, standardized apartments versus extended families who cooperate on maintaining a standalone dwelling. Constructed at breakneck speed, the apartment complex oddly makes appealing the slowness of life in the thatched roof house. Complicating matters further is that the land itself is subject to intense surveillance. No Won-hee was one of the few prominent women members of Reality and Utterance, a leading group associated with the important movement of Minjung art, loosely translated as people's art. The frieze-like painting here shows bare trees. In each tree is not a bird's nest, but a loudspeaker, a direct reference to an authoritarian government that thought nothing of infringing the privacy of every citizen with mandatory announcements. A single man, dressed like a salaried white-collar worker, is caught in mid-step. Not only is he surrounded by the forest of intrusive sounds, he is walled in by them. Sound not only violated personal freedoms, it could put you in actual jeopardy in a time of martial law. Baeksunam vividly depicts how policing happened through innuendo, gossip, and hearsay, neighbor pitted against neighbor. A metaphor of gossip, a small group of black crows gather under a tree. Around and behind them are graffiti-like scribbles layered on top of each other to indicate the inescapability of suspicion. But also, this is a time when the ear itself became a weapon. But there are also artworks around which ordinary citizens rallied, particularly the middle class, who might have been expected to simply fall in line with an authoritarian government. Before you, in the center, in the top row, is one of the most iconic and frequently reproduced photographs in all of Korean history. A testament to the political efficacy of photography, it was taken by the Reuters photographer Chung Tae-won, who was witnessing a pro-democracy uprising at Yonsei University in Seoul, ground zero for many key such uprisings throughout the 1980s. What initially was a group of 50 students had swelled to 1,000. Riot police fired tear gas into the crowd, and a canister hit Lee Han-yeol, one of the young protesters who later succumbed to his injuries. This triggered an immense public outcry, culminating in the largest funeral ever to take place in Seoul with over 1 million mourners. Eventually, this forced direct presidential elections to take place, contributing to the establishment of democracy in South Korea. A huge banner based on a woodcut of the incident was hung at Yonsei University, which you see in the far right. And it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that the banner galvanized public assembly. Certainly, it emphasized how images played a decisive role in creating public space that had not yet existed or was not officially approved, but was absolutely necessary. And the image continues to live on. On the right is a color photograph staged here by Cho Sup. The reenactment echoes the banner, which by this time had passed from grassroots public culture into the institution, as we see on the left, where the banner was part of a retrospective of Minjung art. And here on the left, what once seemed like a flag of defiance seems more than a little domesticated inside the sedate atrium of the National Museum of Modern Contemporary Art, now known as MMCA Gwacheon. Note the title of Cho Sup's work, the date, and the bright red shirt worn by the slumped figure doubling as Lee Han-yeol's avatar. This shirt says, "Be the Reds," the rallying cry for the South Korean soccer team during the 2002 World Cup, co-hosted by Korea and Japan. Is Cho Sup suggesting that nationalist fervor demands individual sacrifice? Cho was born in 1975, meaning that he had lived under both dictatorship and through democracy, and he had lived with both enough to be wary of all spectacles. His skepticism only heightened as those like him who were born in the 1970s were irreversibly affected by the 1997 IMF crisis, or the Asian financial crisis that hit the Korean middle class with such devastating force. Like many artists of his generation, and generation is absolutely pivotal when thinking of Korean art history, Cho Sup questioned Minjung, but he also questioned the Olympics and other structures of visibility that many like him saw as a deflection tactic by a state anxious to conceal its misdeeds. That said, there is an openness his work brings to the Lee Han-yeol image. It becomes something more than an icon, a flashpoint, or a representation. There is an enduring quality about it, a promise of return that underlines Korean art and its histories as an open question. It is for this reason I begin and end today with Kim Hwan-gi's work and why his choice of title is so apt. The connections, encounters, doublings, and reenactments go well beyond familiar structures of categories according to style, materials, or even artistic movements. What we have is an array of openings, exits, entry points, detours, and inversions. So for this reason, let me close with the full text of Kim Kwang-sup's poem. Among a multitude of stars, one stares down at me. Among a multitude of people, I stare up at that one star. As the night grows deeper, it fades into brightness, and I disappear into darkness. Where and in what form will the two of us, you, one so warm, and me, one so tender, meet again? Thank you very much.